Morning. Welcome to the Bible Nation podcast. I'm Doug Levesque from BibleNation.org, here together with Pastor Jason Georges from Emmanuel Baptist Church in Corona, Michigan, EmmanuelAlive.com. Thanks for joining us. We want to talk today about persecution of Christians around the world, and especially in America. What do we have to fear? Back in a moment. What are we standing up for? The ability, the freedom to do what's right as God defines that right.
God's the ultimate author of liberty.
We don't want government to stand between us and our freedom to do what is right.
Welcome back. Thanks for joining the podcast. Remember, the best culture is a Bible culture. It's proven and it works. Today we're going to talk about Christian persecution in America. But before we start, let's look at what's going on in the news. Pastor Jay, OJ is dead.
Yeah, can you believe it? That kind of came out of nowhere. I didn't
know he had cancer.
Yeah, I didn't know he had cancer either.
76 years old, prostate cancer.
Yeah.
Prostate cancer is one of those ones that you survive.
Yeah.
Prostate one of
If
those
you catch it early.
Yeah, if you catch it, but like guys will have it and it'll go, 1, 2, 3, 4. But you can. It takes a long time. So, unfortunately, I'm old enough to remember the juice. I'm old enough to remember USC.
Oh yeah.
And
well,
the way people talk about certain people today in football, he was that. His movement, his football skills were unlike anybody else's.
Yeah.
He was. People were playing football and he was like skating on a rink. It was just different. And then he went to the Bills and had a great NFL career and all that kind of stuff. And so, he was iconic, and that's why all of a sudden he was suspected of murder. And when that went on, that kind of made the whole genre of court TV.
Oh yeah,
it didn't exist before
and
that.
The helicopter chase. Yeah. So I never watched an OJ. I've never watched an OJ game live. I mean, I'm a little too young for that. Yeah. So I know about OJ and I know about his NFL career.
I was from Southern Cal.
But I was a white Bronco on the. I remember watching that, and I think I was home for school or something, and I saw the whole drama on play. Yeah. What drew my attention to it was the vehicle I was driving was the same Bronco.
You had the white Bronco?
But not a white one. I had a blue and silver one, but that same model, full size.
Yeah.
I had a 1986 full-size Ford Bronco.
Did your high school buddies mock you for the Bronco chase?
No. That's a Texas truck.
Is that
That's a Texas truck.
So OJ was iconic for a lot of reasons, but the fact of the matter is I think a lot of white America felt like he was guilty. Like it was just not because he was black, because everybody loved OJ,
right? But
because it was just upsetting, and there were bloody shoe prints, and then they found the shoes, and then he said, I would never do that, and then they found pictures of him in the shoes and stuff. So it was like overwhelming evidence that seemed that way. And then if the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit. Like, that's not legal.
That's not Johnny Cochran.
Yeah, Johnny Cochran. It just sounded like a used car salesman sort of thing. And then yet the black community was just thrilled. And prior to that, you had Rodney King get beat by white police officers. Mm-hmm. So it was just the racism in L.A. was potent and powerful. And then after that, there were riots after that as well. Yeah. So people, you can kind of say, oh, O.J. died and this was it. But it was huge in the day. It was on the news every day.
Yeah, and you would almost say, that the historical significance was the introductory chapter to our current kind of playbook of race relations.
Yeah.
Here's this thing that happens, and now we're going to riot. Now, we're near Detroit,
right?
And so we understand the riots from the 60s and whatnot. But those riots in the 60s were met with a strong military government, state, but almost military response.
Yeah.
Which that defined Detroit, and Detroit's still defined by that event.
Yeah.
The OJ and the Rodney King kind of it was a different type of police response that we see now.
Yes.
And it was really a little bit more of let the rioting happen. Like there's rioters, and to a level. Remember the guys in L.A. were, protecting the shops, the stores. Well, why were business owners on top of their buildings protecting the stores? Because the police were kind of like, hey, we got to let them. We got to let the riot happen a little bit to release this energy. Yeah. And that was different than how we handled it in Detroit. And so that kind of sparked the new way. And now, of course, all the way to what happened on the West Coast in Seattle or Portland and Antifa and Milwaukee.
Chicago,
those big riots where we're just like, letting it burn. Lawlessness.
You have ESPN is so very political today. And so they've kind of let wokeness and then even some kind of black wokeness and stuff, on the show, and it seemed you can sense it, you can feel it, but that goes back to like OJ. This is an in. We have this big sports thing that the whole white community, and either are they trying to crucify him or not. So it's just sad. If we had brotherly love, if we had gospel culture, then we would handle it differently. But as we've got into modernity, we've relied upon the flesh, and the flesh will go to these things. And so it's just sad. Great football player. There was a private court case after the criminal court case.
The civil case.
Yeah, and he was found culpable.
Yeah.
And they never got any money because he kind of went broke or hid his funds or whatever. And so it just was a sad, sad story. But you know what? Death comes upon every man. It's appointed a man wants to die. I hope OJ was saved because he's going to face his maker. And then, the grace of God can forgive all manner, of sin. But we've lost a football icon, but it's reminding us of the cultural divide that's amongst us. Also in the news, I thought was interesting, Pastor Georges, in that we've talked here a little bit about Taiwan and China and potential war, but I don't know if this makes it more or makes it less. But today we have the head of Japan and the head of the Philippines, and President Biden and all the leaders in D.C. talking about military alliance and actually boosting military alliance. Well, to me, it's hard to think that we would boost military alliance because we are the nuclear umbrella for these nations, and we've had strong military ties. And so how do you make them more? We have a tie with Australia, the UK, New Zealand, and Canada for kind of the Pacific realm. But now the Australia is kind of in this Japan, Philippines, U.S. alliance as well. The only thing the only hole that there is that Korea and Japan have never been able to unite, just because of their history. And so United States has strong ties with Korea, and Korea has an incredible army, bigger army than Japan. But Japan has the Navy. They have the Navy. And so hopefully if anything happens, they'll be able to be on board with that. The only question was, were there going to be some Taiwanese representatives in this meeting? Because in the past, we've just kind of let that be ambiguous, right? That Taiwan is ultimately part of China or the other China or whatever. But now that's the issue. So it'd be interesting to find out what happened today. Were there Taiwanese political or military representatives in this meeting, and are they part of this Pacific Alliance now? One thing that probably didn't get talked about a lot was that Indonesia and Malaysia are huge armies and huge military. So is Vietnam. And while they have ties with us, they also have ties with China. So they're kind of playing the middle. They have their own NATO, amongst them. But then Singapore and Thailand have traditionally been American allies. Singapore is one of the few people like the UK or Israel that we sell F-35s to. And so it'll be interesting today to see just how big this meeting was, because with all the news, this kind of slipped in. But it seems to me this hasn't happened in a long time. Yeah. And that this is a big response.
A shift.
A shift, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I met this last week a lifelong missionary to Japan.
Oh, wow.
And we just had a student go and spend a whole summer in Japan. And we have another person on staff, Samantha, that spent a couple years in China. And so kind of our history was after World War II, MacArthur, he opened up missions to the Asia-Pacific realm. And Americans responded, and, Baptists and other Christians. And so we've had 70, 80 years of open mission going, or at least a lot of missions going to where the gospel, but it hasn't been super fruitful. I think probably the 90s, we had a lot of churches start, a lot of salvations, a lot of open doors from different things that hadn't happened. And it seems to me like it's might be tightening up. That might go with our Christian persecution message as well. But hey, pray for your missionaries over the Asian Pacific realm, and for those that are in Japan. Again, this is like the the Cuba Missile Crisis in '63. It's like we're on DEFCON 4. Right. Red lights are going off, but we need to pray for them. And then the last thing was, we've talked a lot about life and abortion here, and we probably will more again. But Arizona upheld a 1800s abortion ban.
Right.
Roe v. Wade got rejected by the Supreme Court that Trump put in, and he put it back to the states. And amazingly, Arizona, which is 50-50 state, kind of like Michigan is, they upheld this abortion ban, and they asked Trump, what do you think about abortion or having some federal ban? And he said, no, I would never have a federal ban. I take full credit, he called it credit, for, overturning Roe v. Wade, and I think it should be a state issue. Well, then Arizona does this, and he says, I think Arizona's gone too far. So is that politics and a politician or what? It should be a state issue, but then when the state does that, he doesn't back Arizona. He says, I think Arizona's gone too far. And, of course, the issue is, what about rape, incest, or what's the other? Rape, incest, that they allow it, or medical emergency or something like this. And so, he really showed his colors. He's not necessarily anti-abortion. Like he'll play that, and that plays into what we talk about as well. But that's big in the news, and so kudos to Arizona, the citizens, the legislature that stood firm. Their definition of life goes back to the 1800s, and it's infuriating everybody else, on going on that. And I'm sure it'll be attacked, and we're going to see an attack and a battle out there in Arizona. But Arizona,
which also reminds us that this is not a new issue.
Right.
I mean, there was already laws on the book in the 1800s, meaning it was already a practice that, society had said no.
Yeah.
Like, this is not for civil society.
Yeah.
This is a good society doesn't do these things.
Yeah.
And so the shift has not been, it's not like we're inventing laws to define who we are now. We have changed who we are.
Yes.
In other words, because so that 1800s law is a picture of who we were then.
Yes.
And
where were we standing? What do we believe about life?
And now we're changing the laws because we have changed as a people. Yeah. And so then it demands us to ask ourselves, have we changed for the better?
Right.
Are we better people? Are we a better society?
Yeah.
Are we a better nation when we have allowed these changes?
Yeah.
Everything from life to marriage to everything. And you and I would argue, and that's kind of the point of the Bible Nation Society, is we're not.
We've left our moors.
Yeah, we're not better. We're worse. We're worse.
Because we've been a Christian nation, you can't have a Christian nation, but because we've had a Bible culture in America, right? And we've been one of the nations that is more or less a Bible nation, in our culture. We have done a lot of things well and right, or the Bible has directed us so, and God has blessed us. So with all these blessings, we've had technology. And so we've advanced medicine as much, if not more, than any other place has advanced medicine. And so with that blessing, and with the blessing of tolerance, as Christians, we would tolerate someone else's religious freedom because you can't mandate that. So with these blessings also came, overconfidence, because then all of a sudden in medicine, we're like, well, let's take our medicine and our tolerance and let's take care of this issue of women who get pregnant that didn't want to be pregnant or whatever. And so that level of stuff didn't get discussed around the world as much as it got discussed here. So while we're the leader in blessings and then technologies and tolerances and all these kind of stuff, we've also been the leader in compromise because it brought us to that. And what we did with God's blessings was not uphold God. What we did with God's blessings is uphold man. And so that's a lesson when you get blessed, right, to do something. So, hey, that's in the news. Those things tie into persecution. And, on our show notes, guys, and Jackson's here with us today, let's start with persecution around the world. Okay, so you got a bunch of things on there. Persecution is real, right? Christians have always been persecuted. Believers have always been persecuted. Since Christ resurrected, ascended, and and went into heaven, promised he's coming back. And so, the Roman world did get overturned, but it took 400 years of persecution of Christians, right? I mean, after a while, we did win, but even then, persecution didn't end, and it's continued. And when you look at the headlines, Pastor Jay, you can just find a couple there in the last 5-6 months.
Right.
It's never stopped, and I think around the world it is increasing. Places like Nigeria, right, where the Christians, the missionaries, the hostels where they keep young people or they take orphans and stuff are just getting, like Muslims there are going in and just slaughtering people. You look in places like Russia and Ukraine, that's actually a religious war. And now the charge is recently that the Russian Orthodox are coming in and kind of cleaning out the Ukrainian evangelicals. And so, that's real. In China, they had a semblance of openness, but then they had a registered church and they had an unregistered church, but all of a sudden now they're going after the unregistered church and they're destroying buildings and arresting pastors and these kinds of things. So, my perspective over the last 5 years is that real persecution where people are jailed, lose their freedoms, disappear, beaten, killed, that's real. So this is no joke.
Right. There are, we often, in our Western view of even our interpretation of Scripture, sometimes we think of future tribulation.
Right.
And we believe that eschatologically, right?
Yes, sir.
But there are people in the world today, there would be Christians in the world to say, what are you talking about future tribulation?
Right.
If this isn't tribulation.
Yes.
And so we know in some of the desert, in some of the parts of Africa, there are believers that are perpetually in fear of their life. And we know in the Islamic nations, there are Christians that are perpetually in fear of their life. And, from their perspective, they would say, this is tribulation.
Right.
And I dare say that even as they read the Scripture, if in depending on how sophisticated they are theologically, they might even say, what that is saying, that's now.
I'm in tribulation.
Yeah,
right
I'm
now.
now. That's now.
And Jesus said you would have that.
Yep.
But I think we've just been blessed in our lifetimes and in the dispensation of the United States of America, the last 250 and the colonial period, 350 years, that we've had the liberty to at least speak out and fight and legislate and all these kinds of things. So we've had very little real, painful to the flesh persecution. And the persecution around the world is real, it's increasing. In Europe, they have buckled down on people who want to educate their kids, homeschool their kids or have Christian education, home churches, house churches, things of this nature. And so now even Western Europe that's supposed to be Christian, they've got an underground church. They've got underground education. And so people are meeting and they're saying, well, we're having a birthday party or we're having an anniversary or we're celebrating we're having just a sing or a music practice, or they're saying everything but church, because it's getting untenable in certain areas of Europe to freely worship Christ according to the Bible's dictates.
Yeah, and sometimes, like I mentioned there in Africa and in Islamic countries, the persecution comes by the end of the sword or the end of the gun.
Yes.
But then what you're talking about in Europe, that's persecution that comes by the legislative pen.
Law is a weapon.
Yeah, and sometimes those laws are, laws that forbid Christianity, or really are more laws that forbid Christian thought or morals. But they even go more insidious than that, because sometimes they just make it impossible to operate religiously.
Yes.
And so I don't necessarily need, you can have a law that says, well, you're not allowed to believe this, you're not allowed to preach this, but just as effective as a law that says you're not allowed to own property. You're not allowed to meet. You're not allowed to have this.
We can separate you from your children.
This zoning. We planted a church in Southeast Michigan, 20 plus years ago, and we were renting a storefront. And that was where we were gonna start the church. It was gonna be our office and whatnot. And the township gave me a lot of problems. Like, you can't start a church here. And I said, well, why not?
Yeah.
And so, well, it's not zoned for that. And I said, well, what am I going to do? I'm going to gather 20, 30 people together. I get capacities. We're not going to put more people in this space than need to be.
Right.
I said, and we're going to talk about something.
Right.
I said, the guy next door to us was an insurance salesman that was opening. And he was, it was like Primerica. It was like seminars and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I was like, what I'm doing is no different than what they're doing.
It's insurance,
and they're like, well, they're talking about something different. And I said, and that's the issue.
Right.
And the zoning guy told me, he says, they're meeting for a different purpose, or they're talking about something different. And I said, well, this is America. And you don't get to say what we meet for.
Right.
So anyways, so those are the kind of things that really frustrate or can hinder the free exercise of religion, which is a pinnacle, foundational piece of our American society. The free exercise of religion.
The phrase no taxation without representation came from Christians who said, we live in this part of America and the government is taxing us to fund a church that we don't go to. Basically government funded church. Right. And we just came from England that had government funded church, right? The king is the head of the church, and we're getting taxed, and that's paying for the cleric down the road, and they're persecuting us because we're not going to church and we're going here, and they had forms of persecution in that. And so They wanted that whole scheme undone.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, the Constitution wasn't going to get passed by them because it was just exchanging the King's Law for another tyrant law until we had the Bill of Rights.
Right.
And so since then, our nation has been like, no, everybody can believe what they want to believe. And the government can't tax anybody for that in order to pay and mandate belief. And that's what religious liberty is.
Right. The government cannot constrain the conscience.
Yes.
The government can't
Tax it.
Yeah. So therefore, we give space and protection to the conscientious objector in our society.
Yes.
And that's honored.
Yes.
I mean, and we struggled with that.
Yeah.
We struggled during wartime when you have the pacifist who says, I can't
do this.
I can't do this. But we struggled with it in the Revolutionary War, in our defining, when you had the Quakers, particularly from Pennsylvania, that were having a hard time. Like, they didn't like
Taking
what the
up
king was
arms.
doing, but they couldn't take up arms against their countrymen.
Right.
And so that's been part of our national identity. It's in the fabric of our DNA.
Yeah.
But we have always given space to it.
Yeah.
And the day we stop giving space to it is the day we cease being who we are.
It's always problematic, but we've always said this is a problem that we're going to underline with let someone's conscience be free.
Yeah.
And that's always won in the courts, actually.
Right.
Here. And so
and you and I are probably principally more adamant, whatever people would want to label you and I as culturally, we are more adamant for the freedom of conscience than we are even above policy sometimes. In other words, the only time we really object to a policy is not as policies when that policy infringes the conscience of somebody else.
Right.
Now, we've preached about marriage and we've preached about the LGBTQ movement and whatnot, and we preach about that in a moral sense, but we have no more bite than our freedom of expression to preach the gospel.
Right.
That's all the bite we put into that.
Yeah.
We're not saying murder. We're not saying or incarcerate. We're not. No. That's the only bite.
Yeah.
But the flips. But like people say, why do those things why do those groups or those movements annoy you so much? Well, they don't annoy me. They infringe upon my conscience.
Yeah.
Hey, you're free to go to a street corner and say whatever you want. And I don't have to hear it.
Yeah.
I could drive away. I don't have to hear it. But when you force me against my will to support and more by taxation.
Yeah.
But even at that, there's a level of Christian patience. All right.
Yeah.
I don't like this.
Right.
But you can't tell me what to believe.
Right.
You can't go in. My brain and my soul and my spirit are sacred.
Yeah.
And you do not get to infringe upon that. And our church is sacred. I mean, there's a whole other argument to it, but
what I would call biblical morality
right.
Has never risen to the height of law and constitution, right? It's always been challenged. It's always been disobeyed. Okay, we're going to get rid of alcohol. Okay, well, then we're not going to get rid of alcohol. You can't tell someone they can't have alcohol, sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And if it's a matter of that woman's body, we say, well, you can't have well, it's my body. You can't tell me what's my body. And so there's always that kind of issue going back and forth, and we're always the tolerant ones on that. It seems that when you get to the LGBTQ arguments, all of a sudden it's religious liberty and they're saying, no, they're kind of jumping over in our lane and saying, no, this is the morality that we're going to have, and they're kind of using the same lane, and so it doesn't really shift.
So kind of bringing this back to Trump, right?
Yeah.
Because now we're talking about he's using as political currency.
Yeah.
I am with you on these this Christian persecution.
Right.
But he's defining it a little bit different.
Yes.
Because he doesn't join us in those squares.
No.
In those squares that we say, let's use LGBTQ or marriage, and we say that ideology and religious liberty cannot occupy the same space. Right. And so we are in the free market of ideas. We are making the argument, and that religious liberty, it better occupies that spot than these other agendas.
Right.
That's the argument and so if we're going to Lansing, if we're going to Washington, D.C., that's the argument we're making.
Yeah.
That's the argument we're making. But he doesn't choose to stand there.
And I would say we were winning that argument until he was president.
Right.
Because we were winning against the LGBTQ argument with religious liberty in the state of Michigan as far as LGBTQ civil rights until the same Supreme Court that overturned Roe v. Wade actually made homosexual civil rights the federal law of the land.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now
he's not defended us.
So what's a little like doesn't pass the smell test here with Trump, right?
Right.
Is we've just been talking about for 10 minutes.
Yeah.
There is real Christian persecution.
Yeah.
And we ought to give attention to that.
Yeah.
You know, as you were talking about that, I brought up Voice of the Martyrs, a great organization that brings worldwide awareness to the plight or the persecution of Christians, right? Shout out to them, right? Shout out to them. But then what Trump is saying, you see, Trump is not saying, I'm going to use my influence to help those persecuting Christians. He is saying, those people that disagree with me politically and culturally are persecuting me like Christians are persecuted.
Yes.
And he's naming himself amongst the martyrs.
Yeah.
And listen, Trump may be a lot of things, and he might have got the short end of the stick on some deals that he's made, but he's no martyr.
He ain't no martyr.
He ain't no martyr.
He ain't no martyr.
He ain't no Apostle Paul.
No.
He ain't no James.
Yeah.
He ain't no John. You know, he's no martyr.
He's had a couple fines. He hadn't spent a night in jail.
Right.
Everyone around him has had fines and gone to jail. But yet he and those around him have actually made anti-Christian remarks and used the term Christian. Like, these Christians have better get on board or they're not with me. Or
Well, and not one of his troubles,
Yeah.
not one of those fines have been because of his sincerely held religious beliefs.
Right.
No.
No.
They have all been because of his shady business dealings.
Yes. And women.
Right, and women. right. That's where all. And so you can't claim persecution. No. Yeah, I can't go around and be a womanizer, and then when the local prosecuting attorney is coming after me for a bunch of things and say, well, you know, that's persecution.
You're a philanderer.
Right.
Yeah, right. The other thing is we did an episode on white Christian nationalism to kind of separate ourselves from it.
Yep.
And so, you know, we might not be black, and so therefore we're white. We might not be atheists, and therefore we're Christians. And we might not be rebels, and we're patriots. But that doesn't put us in the same thing. The media is trying to say that anybody who, you know, looks like that, tastes like that is a MAGA idiot, Nazi, fascist, right?
Right.
And some of these people are playing right into it because they are that.
And that's the biggest concern.
And because he's saying persecuted, he's playing into them, and that's racist. Mm-hmm. He's playing, and I don't know that he's a racist, but he's playing that. You know, I don't know that he's a grand Christian, but he's playing that.
Well, all we know about Trump, I don't know enough about him to know if he's a racist or not.
Right.
He's a Trumpist.
He's a Trumpist.
That he is all about Trump, and he will play
your own horn.
Right. He will play the card
Yeah.
that will get him what he wants.
Jay, the bad thing is there's nobody else to vote for. I mean, he's like the only guy
and
that
I get
seems
it.
like he's for America.
I know, and I get it.
Yeah.
And there's certain rhetoric and sentiment that he says. I'm like, I'm glad someone's saying that.
Yeah.
But I'm all, you know, my allegiance is greater to Christ, and so there's certain virtues and things that it just you can't cancel out. But here's the issue: Trump would be better if political Christians would be better.
Yes.
Because if we wouldn't just bow down to him, he needs us more than we need him.
Yeah.
He needs us more. I wish I could tell that to everybody.
Yeah.
We could actually, because we know he is a creature of popularity, like he's a creature of affirmation.
Yeah.
We could totally influence him.
Yeah. Manipulate him
into what he would need to be.
And this is what Bible
if we would withhold our affection,
our praise,
and just say, hey, no, this is what we
say about the best culture is a Bible culture. If the people running for office have to pretend and placate the Christian voice, I'd rather live in that country.
Yes.
Where he has to try to sell a Bible and say Easter Jesus, you know, the Easter Jesus, right? Where we know that, like, Mr. Trump, you're not reading that Bible. And Mr. Trump, you don't really believe.
What was it, 2 Corinthians?
Or something. And so, but we're all thrilled that somebody's saying that.
Right.
But I'm glad that has to be placated in America.
Right.
But we're only one election away from where that's no longer it. And so most people placate to the economy. They placate to liberty in the sense of licentiousness.
Right.
And I think that's why some Christians are fooled, because here's a guy that's holding up the Bible and saying Jesus. And the reality, though, he's the persecuted Jesus. And white Christian nationalists are being persecuted. And that's kind of why I wanted to do this. Not that persecution is not real and we shouldn't be concerned with it. Not that there's not growing persecution in America, especially for churches and religious liberty, homeschooling, things of that nature. But because we need to be aware of the rhetoric, what's real and what's not real. And we're fighting all the time for ourselves to have liberty in Christianity, and particularly with education of our children, things of that nature. property ownership. We live on a main highway, and if they decide they want to expand the highway and we have to tear our church down, that's going to be a court case. We probably won't win.
Actually, we had that meeting yesterday morning.
Yeah, because Trump is all for what's that called when the government
eminent domain.
Trump is for eminent domain. He's proven it as long as he's making money.
He's profited from eminent domain.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so so I think the message is as far as our Bible culture is concerned, folks, hold on to your Bibles, hold on to religious liberty. Pray for those that are being persecuted around the world. Fight for your own liberties properly. Don't fall into this pseudo-Christian group or this pseudo-Trump messianic ideal, because it's really not helping any concept of Christian persecution, and in fact may turn against real. If it truly is fascist, and it may turn against, and so then we'll be actually fighting them and fighting our own about what freedoms can we have and what freedoms can we not have in that regard. And so I think that politically, but scripturally, as we are going to face real persecutions, people are getting beat up, right? Not just in the media. People are getting beat up, not just in the court, because the media is beating us up and persecuting us, and the courts are weaponizing against us. But when population, when all of a sudden the one thing that people kind of turn the head to or turn a blind eye to is the actual shutting up of Christians or beating up of Christians or jailing pastors, and it gets real. And I mean, we're right there. We're right on the edge of it. What do we do then according to the scriptures? Pastor Georges?
Yeah, in John 15:20, Jesus said, "Remember the word that I have said unto you, the servant is not greater than his Lord. If they have persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they have kept my saying, they will keep yours also." And so, Jesus is saying, don't let this surprise you.
Right.
First of all, and then
it should be in the Christian life, if you're doing it right, it's going to be the expectation.
I heard one modern day commentator preacher say the problem with preachers today is no one's trying to kill them.
Yeah.
Because that's always been the role of it.
So you can't be afraid when all of a sudden you have the world against you,
right? Or
you have pseudo-Christianity against you. You're actually in the right spot.
Which it actually brings upon the very thing you fear. It brings more on it.
Yeah.
And so brings more of that upon you.
Yes.
And so this idea, especially of the pulpit, just placating to the sympathies of fickle society and culture that is, more influenced by TikTok and Instagram and whatnot, and kind of moving around with that instead of just standing on the enduring principles of God's word,
right?
And not to be labeled by the world, but to be labeled by what Christ says.
Yeah.
And so just because someone because if the culture calls me something, doesn't mean I am.
Right.
Doesn't mean I am. And yet we get so afraid of that.
Yeah.
And so now we are, how many pastors are getting in a pulpit and they can't freely preach because they're trying to navigate the societal landmines that they see before them.
If you have 2 church members or 2 social media negative comments, then you shut up.
Right.
And I'm like,
or for fear that one person may not like it.
Right. Yeah.
And then you're like,
that's a problem.
That is a problem.
That's such soft persecution.
And that's a problem in the pulpit, and that's a problem in the pew.
Yeah.
And people need to have a little bit more a thicker skin about things.
Absolutely.
Like, hey,
I was preaching a meeting for really Bible Nation Society this last week, and so I was addressing the Bible and culture issues, and a man came up to me and asked a really good question. It was really about kind of Second Amendment type issue. He goes, "At what point in time do Christian Americans stand up and say no, like regarding I'm just not going to pay taxes, or it's time to fight or something like that?" Now most people think, "Oh, that's horrible," but it's not horrible. The left is doing that. The left says that kind of stuff. So that was a legitimate question. And I said, you got to go back to our forefathers in the Revolution. Where did they draw the line? There's a book called Baptists in the American Revolution.
Yep.
We reprinted it. And what was the line? You came for the powder.
Yeah.
That was like when we can't defend ourselves. When we're just going to come and put our face in the mud and take away our faith and everything. So they felt like you coming to take our powder. That's the line.
Right. I can no longer defend myself.
I can no longer defend myself, and that and that's why they wanted that in the Constitution and stuff as well. So I thought that was a good insight from the guy, good question. I said, and I had to think about it. I said, well, that's my answer on the issue. I would tell people that, don't pay your taxes. Pay your taxes up until that point, because Jesus said pay your taxes, and he put money in the fish's mouth. So we have to respect authority. The authorities that are there from God. They're there to serve God and serve goodness. But when they don't, they'll come for the powder. And then you can say, I'm writing a manifesto. I'm no longer part independent, and I'm going to defend. But until that point, I think I'm going to pay my taxes. And I just think I'm not paying that and that. I'm paying for the road. I'm paying for the tank. I'm not paying for your foolishness. Well, that's how I think. But at any time I decide that I'm not going to pay my taxes and I'm going to lead in that, I better be prepared.
Oh yeah.
For the other, because I think those two things go hand in hand.
Yeah, but Jesus, even in that teaching, tells us everything we need to know.
Yeah.
Well, because Rome wasn't pure. No. Rome supported. Right. I mean, Rome was a very
practiced crucifixion.
Yeah, and it was a very highly sexualized. Culture. Yeah. And so we think it's bad today.
It was multicultural. It was whatever it needed to be.
It was evil, pure lasciviousness without any Christian veneer.
Right.
To hold it back. Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
No
and
moral.
It was tyrannical when it came to authority.
Yeah. No moral decency. Yeah. And Jesus still. Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's.
Mm-hmm. The road.
But what's not Caesar's is God's.
Right. Your
and
conscience.
He made the clear distinction that there's some things that belong to Caesar, and there's some things. Now it all belongs to God.
Your conscience and your self-defense.
It all belongs to God, right?
Right.
But there are some things that only belong to God.
Right.
That Caesar has no claim to.
Right.
And those are the things that Christians are obligated.
Right.
To
freedom of speech,
for.
Freedom of assembly, freedom of press, freedom
all
of
those things.
Religion, all those things.
Yeah. So
and then the means to defend yourself and backing it up. That those two things are there. Now, persecution then comes when we're on that line.
Right.
And I think that's what's resonating in an election season, that Mr. Trump is recognizing but using.
Yes.
And that other people are feeling sensitive about. We're there as well. But we're saying that it's gonna actually increase if it gets manipulated.
Yeah.
And so let's be wise and smart.
When you neither bend nor bow, right? Right. When you neither bend nor bow, we think about the Hebrews there in the book of Daniel. But then the Bible goes on to say, and this has been our historic posture for 2,000 years. Mm-hmm. Bless them which persecute you, bless and curse not.
Hallelujah.
And so even in the, this is where Jesus says, like, if he gets smite, give him the other cheek.
Yep.
Let him smite the other one. Yep. And so, and that is the highest and the noblest of Christian ethics.
Well, this is Romans 12:14, bless them which persecute you. Yeah. That was Paul. He was a persecutor, an injurious, he said. And yet people loved him and gave him the gospel, and so he had to go do the same, and he suffered for doing it.
Right.
But the policeman that comes to enforce a bad law, he might be good or bad, but he's not the problem. Mm-hmm. If you have to spend a night in jail, get a good lawyer, that policeman will get his, but you might win him through that. Daniel had Arioch, captain of the guard, and Arioch's supposed to kill him, but Arioch didn't kill him because Daniel had won him, right, with an excellent spirit. Mm-hmm. And so I think part of our posture in these last Babylonish days is to have a heart that says, God, if I ever get there, I'll direct my prayer to you, I'll direct my love to you, I'll try to win my persecutor, and I'll suffer for well-doing to the extent that I can. And that's not capitulation, because we've talked just as much just a minute ago about where to make your stand.
Right.
You know what I mean? And if you want to make your stand on your own, that'll be your last day. I'm the kind of guy that I probably would get there. You know what I mean? Yep. But if you're not going to make a stand with a bunch of people, you ain't going to win.
Right. And that's what the local church is.
Yeah, and that's what local church is. That's right. And so local churches, pastors, and churches really need to talk about these things, meet on these things, pray on these things. I know we're a paper tiger to some extent, but that's kind of really what we need to be. The best culture is a Bible culture. It's better for everyone else. Even atheists are saying it's the best culture, even though they don't believe. And but it is proven, and it works. Thanks for joining us for our podcast this week. Go to BibleNation.org to check out everything that we have to offer you, and we want to hear from you at BibleNation.org. Thanks for joining us.